Good morning and welcome to the Strategic Farm West research update for summer 2021. My name is Richard Meredith and it's my pleasure to host this webinar for you today. We've got the Strategic Farm East webinar. Welcome as you come in. The purpose of today is to show the live observations and findings of the assessments from the Strategic Farm West trials. Now, the first thing to kind of point out in this process for us is that Rob Fox, the Strategic Farm West host, we congratulate him on getting a new job this spring. So we're actually without the Strategic Farm West host here, so this program will be coming to an end in harvest after harvest 2021. So Rob's been there until last week when he moved jobs. So he's done all the trials as he would normally. We had a fantastic time working with Rob and we congratulate him on this new opportunity. We did manage to get him for a short video for a season update, which I'll be playing in a moment. But just to kind of let you know all about that. So the housekeeping for this webinar is we can't see or hear you, don't panic. So you can make as much noise as you like. Questions, we welcome questions as we go through this webinar. There's a little, you see on the screen there's a little box which says questions where you can type them in. We've got a 10-minute session at the end, and we can take them as we go through, so don't be afraid to put those on. We've got quite a lot to get through. We've got 4 different speakers and we're going to do quite a gallop going through, so I'm going to try and keep the tempo fast as we go through that. And on that note, if you miss anything, then it will be recorded and put up on the AHDB website afterwards. So if you go if you Google AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds YouTube, all of our webinars, there's a whole library of them on there, and you can also see them on the AHDB website. So don't be afraid to look that up. Your basis and erosive points, if you didn't complete them on registration, then please put them in the question box and we'll put them in. For basis, it's account number and postcode and name, and Neroso is Neroso member, date of birth, and your postcode. Quick run through what our plan is for today. After my welcome introduction, I'm going to play you a video welcome introduction from Rob Fox. And then we're going to be going to Kate Smith, where we're talking about soil management in autumn crops establishment. Chloe Morgan, who's talking about the reducing inputs on farm trial that Rob's been running. Then we're going over to the managing weeds without herbicides with Sarah Cook. And then finally, we're looking at the cabbage stem flea beetle trials, which were hosted on the Strategic Farm with Sasha White. And then we'll have a question session at the end. So yeah, so as I said, we're very, very sad to not have a Strategic Farm West host. I've worked with Rob since 2014. He was a monitor farmer before then, a Strategic Farm West host. It's been a fantastic journey that we shared together. But obviously, without a host, we were left slightly stranded without a farm. But Rob did kindly record a video for us, giving us a season overview. He moved over to his new job in Hertfordshire last week. So this is quite recent and up to date. So I'll just play that video and then we'll get over to our speakers.
Hi, I'm Rob Fox. I'm the farm manager at Crob Hall Farm in Leamington Spa. And I'm also the host for the Strategic Farm West. August and September were fairly good months for us here. As you can see, the oilseed rape has established pretty well overall. That's because there was moisture there in August when we drilled, and September was a fairly good, warm, dry month for us. Allowed us to crack on. Rape established pretty well. Wheats went in quite well at the end of September before it started raining, and then obviously a very, very wet October, November, and a very, very wet winter. Generally, crops have fared okay through a very, very wet winter. We've lost small areas of oilseed rape mainly due to the weather, to the wet, and we've lost a couple of small areas of winter wheat, again mainly due to the weather. But all in all, considering how wet the winter was, crops are looking okay at the moment. We've just hit a very dry period now. We are crying out for a bit of rain, but at the moment things are holding up quite well. So for the rest of the season, we're obviously reacting a little bit at the moment to the dry weather. Certainly fungicides in winter wheat, we're doing less than we had planned. Very little wheat has had a P0. We're now, just today, we're now spraying T1s, and they're sort of less robust than they would have possibly been in a wet year. Rape as well, we're hoping for one fungicide on the rape, as it's now all in sort of full flower at the moment. We're trying to reduce our use of insecticides. We've been quite lucky this year. A lot of the rape didn't even need an insecticide for flea beetle this autumn. We managed to get it established and get it away in good conditions that the plants could grow away from the adult beetle. So only about 50% of it received one insecticide. Likewise on the wheats, not all the wheat had a autumn insecticide either. In terms of the beginning of the season, pre-emergence, we're quite blackgrassy here, so pre-emergence is quite heavy on the winter wheats. The unfortunate thing about this year is the amount of rain after spraying. We haven't had the residual effect that we'd hoped for, so we're going to have a fair blackgrass burden, and we've already started to take the decision to spray off certain areas of wheat, because we think the grass levels within them are just too high. Our biggest challenge this year, as always, is the weather. We had a dry September. It was okay for establishing oilseed rape, and that got away all right. But then obviously another very, very wet winter, the second wet winter on the trot for us. And then again for the second year running, once it did dry up in sort of March time, we haven't had any significant rain now for about 6 weeks. So again, as always, the biggest challenge for us is the weather, trying to do the right thing, trying to predict what might be happening, which we all know is incredibly difficult. So this is my concluding year of the Strategic Farm West. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to take it through all the way to the end of the programme as planned due to me moving on to another role somewhere else. All the trials in the ground this year will be taken through to harvest, and then later on in the year after harvest there'll be the opportunity for everyone to have a look at the results, and for us all to have a look at the results and see how things have gone this year. So I consider myself really lucky to have been involved in the Strategic Farm programme, and even though we're coming to the end here, there's still more really good strategic farms around the country, up in Scotland, in the east, and down in the south. So it'll be a really strong programme going forward, I'm sure. In the east, they're just coming into the last 2 years of their programme. Up in Scotland, they're in year 2, and in the north and down in the south, they're just beginning their journey. So should be a really exciting time, and obviously in the future, as more of them end, hopefully more will be online.
Perfect. There we go. Thank you very much to Rob there for sharing that kind of update from the farm. You'll probably tell by when how he's talking about the weather when that was filmed in the first half of May. So without further ado, I'm going to move over to Kate Smith from ADAS. Kate's really going to be bringing together the assessments and findings from the catch crop and the cultivations trials, which have been running at Strategic Farm West over the last couple of years. So Kate, without further ado, I'll pass over to you.
Okay, morning everyone. I'm going to keep my camera off as my internet's a bit slow today. So I'm going to just run through a couple of trials that we have going on at Strategic Farm West that addressing soil management for autumn crop establishment. So it's the catch crop trial and a cultivation trial. So the summer catch crop trial came about after the wet autumn and winter we had in 2019 and 2020, where Rob was unable to establish many crops across his field, autumn crops, or that where his crops failed. So what Rob wanted to look at was, is there any benefit in establishing a summer catch crop compared to leaving the field and stubble? So what were the impacts on soil nitrogen supply, soil structure, and the performance of the following crop? Next slide, please. So the site is on a clay loam soil. We have 3 treatments as part of the trial. The stubble control. We have 2 contrasting catch crops that were established in May 2020 and then destroyed in July by spraying off a glyphosate. That was ahead of drilling winter wheat in September 2020. So the catch crops that we have was a farm standard, so that's barley and beans. That was saved seed from the farm. So with the beans, we've got an N-fixing crop in the mix. And then the second catch crop was a commercial mix that was supplied by AHDB seeds, and that was designed for improving both soil structure and nutrient retention, and that consisted of both Phacelia and oil radish. The treatments were replicated twice across tramlines across the field. And if we go into the next slide, please. So this slide just summarises the performance of the catch crop. So you can see that the highest percentage ground cover and corresponding dry matter and uptake was measured in the beans and the barley catch crop mix, with around 90% ground cover and total nitrogen uptake of around 90 kilograms of N per hectare. Phacelia also was the next highest, but if we compare it to the stubble control, that had a fair amount of ground cover, had a weedy ground cover there, with the providing around 70% ground cover, but total nitrogen uptake was a bit less, was significantly less at around 50 kilograms of N per hectare. If we go on to the next slide then, please. We measured soil nitrogen supply. So this was measured in August ahead of any cultivations of establishing the winter wheat. Soil nitrogen supply includes both the soil mineral nitrogen content down to 90 centimetres, that's the blue bar, and the amount of nitrogen in the above ground biomass, that's shown by the green bars. So looking at the soil mineral nitrogen content, there's no real difference between the treatments. But if we look at the total S&S, we can see that where we have established a catch crop, there is a higher S&S there, with around 120 kilograms of N being retained within the beans barley mix, and that higher S&S is probably attributed to the N fixation by the beans in that mix. If we go on to the next slide, please. So we carried out some soil assessments across the site, and these were carried out in autumn 2020 and repeated this spring. We carried out both a VES, visual evaluation of soil structure, and we also carried out an earthworm count as well at the same time. So looking at the VES scores, we've got on the left, we've got the red bar, the red dotted line, sorry, indicates where we've got poor soil structure, and the green dotted line indicates where we achieve a good soil structure according to the AHDB soil health scorecard. And in general, you can see that on the control plots, we have a poorer soil structure. They were more, the soil was scoring more consistently, scores of 4 or slightly above. where we've established a catch crop, so either the beans, barley, or the Phacelia radish, there was a tendency to have lower scores, so an improvement in soil structure there. The scores in the spring were slightly higher compared to the autumn, and this could be due to either a combination of maybe some slumping over winter, or due to the fact that soils were drier in the spring compared to the autumn, and that affects the scoring of the VES. Just to say that in general, that our site manager who did the scoring, Sam, he said that this was some of the worst soil that he's carried out VES on, and it was really quite poor structure overall. And just to have those scores of 4 across the board was is unusual, really, for us to record. So that that is an improvement there to see that with the catch crops there in the soil structure. And also, anecdotally, Rob found that where the catch crops had been established, it was easier to the soil was more workable and easier to establish the winter wheat crop in September 2020, whereas on the control plots it was wetter and it was just a much sadder soil, really. So anecdotally and with the VES scores, we are seeing that there is an improvement there of soil structure where we've established catch crop. Moving on to the earthworm counts, again the green, where we get green, that scores of 8, we've got an active population of earthworms. Scores of 4, shown by the dotted red line, indicate that earthworm populations have depleted. And in general, we've got an improvement in earthworm populations where we've established a catch crop compared to on the stubble. Okay, final slide, go to the next slide. So the final slide on this trial. So overall, we found that sowing a catch crop, either between crops or where a previous crop has failed or unable to be sown, it provides ground cover, and it captures nitrogen. There was evidence from this trial that the drilling of a catch crop improves soil conditions, so seen with both the soil structure and earthworm activity. And anecdotally, Rob reported that he found that the soils were drier and easier to cultivate where a catch crop had been established. We didn't see any improvement in winter crop establishments, but we're yet to, and obviously this year we're going to analyse the harvest data, and we'll see if there's any difference between the treatments there. Okay, next slide. So moving on to the second trial, this is a cultivations trial that we've had going on at Rob's farm at Strategic Farm West for around 3. This is in its 3rd year now. For this year, there's less data to present, as we've still got data to analyse, and there's a lot more assessments to be carried out later in the year. But this will give you a flavour of what we're doing as part of the trial. So the objective is to look at the impact of cultivation depth on soil properties, and this year that will include soil carbon content. We'll also look at how cultivation impacts on crop development, rooting, and yield. Next slide, please. So this is the trial design. As I said, it's in its 3rd year now. Before the trial was set up, the field site was cultivated down to 15 centimetres depth. So what we're looking at here is looking at the impacts of transitioning the site to direct drill and how that impacts on soil structure and the crop. So let's just bear that in mind as we're talking through this trial. So the treatments that we have, we've got the direct drilling. We have a 5 centimetre cultivation depth that's carried out for shallow spring tine. We have a 15 centimetre cultivation depth and a 30 centimetre cultivation depth, both carried out using a disc aerator. Texture for this site is a heavy clay soil. Go on to the next slide, please. So we've monitored establishment of the winter wheat in this crop, and from the plant counts that we got collected in, that's the graph on the left, we saw that emergence was better on the direct drill. However, when we came to carry out the assessments at stem extension, we found that numbers, plant numbers had reduced, so there was less, and we're lowest on the direct drill, so there's less survival of the plants in the direct drill, possibly due to poor rooting. And then we've also carried out NDVI measurements, and these show that the biomass across the direct drill plots is lesser compared to the other treatments. Interestingly, you can, if you compare growth stage 11 to growth stage 13, we're not seeing such a big increase in NDVI, so there's not an increase in biomass, and this is probably due to the cold winter that we've had and the cold and then dry spring that we've experienced during this time. So we can just see that that's impacted there on crop biomass. Next slide, please. So we've measured Penetrometer resistance. This was carried out in the autumn, and we've got the different treatments. So we've got the direct drill in the dark blue, 30 centimetre in the lighter and the green, 50 centimetres in the green, sorry, and then the 30 centimetres in the yellow. Overall, we found that the 30 centimetre cultivation was less compact, had the loosest soil, shown with the lower Penetrometer resistance values there. The topsoil was most compact within the 5 centimetre cultivation treatments, and that was particularly evident within the top 20 centimetres. And then for the direct drill, we're starting to maybe see the benefits of moving towards direct drill, particularly between the 20 to 25 centimetres depth. And this is probably due to the soil being less trafficked, really. So at longer term, really, it would be interesting to see how the soil condition it continues to improve on these treatments, really, on the direct drill. So moving on to the next slide. So as part of the trial, we're measuring, carrying out rooting assessments, and we've completed the spring rooting assessments and still have the data to analyse. So what we will be doing is carrying out whole plant root assessments. So they'll be analysed for different root traits, including number, weight, density, width, depth, and angle. So it's still quite a bit of analysis to do on the samples, but just to give you an idea for how the plants are looking. So on the left, we've got the plants taken from the 30 centimetre depth cultivation, and on the right, we've got the plants taken from the direct drill treatments. And from the 30 centimetre depth, where we saw that more looser, less compacted soil, we can see that roots are going down deeper and that they're much longer. Whereas on the direct drill, there seems to be a tendency there just visually for shorter roots that are going more vertical. So we'll analyse the data, and we'll see if this continues. This pattern is evident once we've carried out the analysis, really, in full. Next slide, please. So just the emerging messages from this trial. So yeah, following a very poor year in 2020, the wheat has winter wheat has established well this year. So as we've shown, Penetrometer resistance is lowest on the 30 centimetre cultivation treatments, whilst the 5 centimetre cultivation is more compacted compared to the other treatments. Crop emergence was greatest on the direct drill, but as I showed, overwinter survival was worse on this treatment. NDVI measurements show that the biomass production has been low. This is due to us having a cold winter and cold and dry spring. And NDVI was slightly lower on the direct drill crop. So as mentioned, we still have quite a few assessments to carry out. So our next steps is to measure deep rooting and physis, and we'll be carrying out yield mapping of the crop at harvest. Next slide, please. That's it from me, so thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. I've got one very quick question that I'm going to ask that came in as you're going through that, and it's going back to the catch crops. Somebody's asked, you mentioned this is some of the hardest soils you've ever seen to work with, and I've seen that farm described as be better suited for a pottery factory. In your experience with catch crops and in this sphere, do you see it working in other soil types? Have you seen it working in other lighter soil types? Is it this scenario that's making it not bringing out an improvement in that we looked for?
Well, we saw a slight improvement, and there's slight improvement there with the birds. There was an indication there, and I think really the thing is it's quite a short-term impact. So sometimes it might be hard to see that benefit maybe within just the first year of carrying, establishing a catch crop either in the summer or over winter. But if we compare for what we found with, say, Strategic Farm East, even there sometimes you do see benefit, and that's lighter soil. You do see benefits on with earthworms and numbers as well, sometimes quite quickly. So it just varies with soil types and years, but in general, for have the largest effect, it would have to be a longer term management you'd expect. Fantastic,
awesome. Thank you very much, Kate. I'm gonna keep us moving to get through the agenda. The next speaker we've got is Chloe Morgan from ADAS. Chloe manages the trial, and I've very simply put the aim of it is reducing inputs on farm, and that's what Rob's kind of encompassing kind of aim for this trial was. And Chloe kindly manages Rob, Emily, and myself to do that. So yeah, Chloe, thank you very much, and I'll go over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so this trial is looking at reducing inputs on farm, in particular fungicide inputs, through the use of more resistant varieties. So in this trial, we're looking at high, medium and low fungicide inputs. So there's quite a wide range of varieties out there available now with a range of resistance ratings. If you just move on, Richard, as a plant pathologist, I quite often carry out trials on susceptible varieties because I'm looking for differences in efficacy between products and trying to draw them apart. But there are a lot of varieties out there now with quite high resistance ratings against the key foliar pathogens. So these are taken from the recommended list. You can see X-Days, Prince, Illuminate, Merit, Astronomer and Theodore, all of which have got ratings from 6.6 up to 9 for the yellow rust, brown rust and Septoria tritici. So yeah, all quite high resistance ratings. You can also see the difference between treated grain yield and untreated grain yield compared to the percent control is quite small generally in these varieties, smaller than those that are more susceptible. So effectively you're getting a smaller response from fungicide applications. So it does raise the question really, what sort of fungicide input is appropriate for these sorts of varieties, and where you actually have the potential to reduce your fungicide inputs due to the high resistance ratings. So if we move on to the next slide, the aim of this trial is to determine the effect of reduced fungicide applications on varieties with different disease ratings under sort of high, medium and low fungicide inputs. So moving on, I'll just briefly talk about the weather conditions before I start to talk about the trial. So again, it's been quite an abnormal start to the season. These graphs here show the conditions in April. On the left, we've got the mean temperature compared to the 1981 to 2010 long-term mean. On the right, we're looking at rainfall, both taken from the Met Office. So you can see on the left, the temperatures where we're seeing blue are below average, so that's that long-term mean. We did have quite a cold April with quite a few episodes of frost throughout the month. See on the right there, we also saw some quite dry conditions, so anything that's brown is below average, which is most of the UK. Anything in the very dark brown is 20% of the average rainfall. So again, very dry conditions in April. Moving on, we'll look at May. So again, we saw quite lower than average temperatures in May compared to the long-term mean. It's still a cold month generally, but we did see quite a lot of rainfall. Again, the blue areas on that map on the right-hand side are showing above average rainfall. The darkest blue is more than 200% of the average. So some areas in particular were extremely wet, and you can see Wales and the southwest in particular. What this means for diseases is that the cold temperatures generally slow down diseases. It slows down the life cycle, so it takes the disease slightly longer to infect the plant and then express the symptom. It also will check any sort of yellow rust. So yellow rust can be controlled by the frost that we saw in April. It prefers temperatures of between 5 to 15 degrees to really allow it to progress. The dry conditions in April have also limited septoria. We know that septoria is spread through a crop by rainfall as it splashes the spores up throughout the crop. So that did mean that septoria remained on the lower leaf levels generally, didn't spread up the crop, and those newly emerged leaves tended to be sort of have very little latent infection in them when it came to T1. So if we now move on, I'll discuss the trial briefly. So in the field, we've got two different varieties just split in the field. So at the top half of the field, we've drilled X days, and the bottom half is siskin, just divided by that red line in the middle there. So these both group 2 varieties, quite popular varieties. X days is slightly more resistant with ratings of 7 and 8 for yellow rust, brown rust and septoria. Siskin a bit more susceptible, particularly to brown rust with a rating of 5, and septoria with a rating of 6.5. And then if we move on one, I'll just talk about the fungicides that we've got here. So the small, very light blue area at the bottom on that variety divide line is where we have left the area completely untreated, so we can gauge sort of the background level of disease in this trial. We've then got 3 different fungicide treatments in the form of a high input, a medium input and a low input fungicide program. And these have been replicated within each of those varieties. So you can see treatment 1 is in the green, and we've got 3 tramlines within each of those varieties that are being applied. Treatment 2 in the blue and treatment 3 in the grey. And this allows us to analyse the yield mapping data from this trial at the end of the season and hopefully give us some statistically robust results. In terms of what's been applied so far, there was no T0 given that it was quite dry and cold. There's no yellow rust in the trial. T1s, we differed between the high, medium and low inputs, so they were applied on the 26th of April. The high input received Ascra Expro at 0.8 litres. The medium input had a tebuconazole of 0.7 with Arizona at 1.5, and then the low input was left completely untreated given how dry April had been. The T2 was then applied on the 26th of May, and all treatments received the same application of Riverstar XC at 0.9 litres per hectare. This was because obviously we had a lot more rainfall in May, so we're in a higher risk scenario. So yeah, the same treatment was applied to all. So if we move on to the next slide, we've done some biomass assessments so far, looking at the GAI and NDVI of the canopy as it's been developing. So here we can see the NDVI results, which were taken in the field, taken on the 7th of April, the 20th of April and the 26th of May. See in April, so the first assessment on the 7th of April, the values were just between 0.6 and 0.7. And there wasn't much progression between that and the 20th of April, with very similar values. And that's down to the very cold temperatures. Crops in some places almost seem to stand still through April. But then NDVI has increased by the 26th of May, just above 0.8, as the crops did start to push on as temperatures warmed up, and those top 3 leaf layers have emerged. You can also see there's a difference between the 2 varieties, so the X days in green and the siskin in orange. And in April, in both assessments, the X days has slightly higher NDVI than the siskin. And we saw this in the field, as X days was generally slightly ahead of the siskin in terms of growth stage. By the 26th, however, they've actually almost evened out, siskin looking slightly higher, although the difference between them is pretty small. So moving on to the next slide, we've looked at satellite NDVI images, which actually also reflect what we saw in the field. So you can see again, on the 27th of December there on the left-hand side, the X days at the top of the field had higher NDVI with a bluer colour, and the siskin towards the bottom, which is largely green. But by the 31st of May, the field's looking quite different, with the siskin actually at the bottom there in the blue, having higher NDVI than the X days, which does have some lower areas. So moving on to the next slide, In terms of disease, we are seeing quite low levels of disease in the crops at the moment. Given how dry it's been, there's no yellow rust in the crop. These were photos taken a couple of weeks ago from the untreated areas, and as you can see, we've just got septoria on the lower leaf levels. Those tables at the bottom are just missing the data, but we have got about 1% septoria on leaf 4, and we're getting about 5% septoria on leaf 5, so currently low levels. But we should start to see those levels increase given the rainfall we've had and as temperatures warm up. So we're going to start assessing these crops, so the tramlines from next week onwards. They'll be assessed every 2 weeks, so we can see how the disease develops in each of those treatments, and also monitor the greenleaf area decline to see if any treatments hold on to that greenleaf area a bit longer than others. So moving on to the next slide, just to summarise this project. So we know that we've got varieties of greater resistance for offering us the potential to reduce our fungicide inputs. And in this trial, we're looking to test that. So far, the differences of scrub haul have been minimal due to conditions and largely due to varietal differences in growth. Disease levels are currently low, given the weather that was received in both varieties, but we're expecting to see these increase over the next few weeks. So yeah, watch this space. I'm sure we'll hopefully be able to see some differences as those levels increase and we see differences in the T1 strategies. Yeah, that's all from me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chloe. In terms of the kind of the wider implications for growers and agronomists watching this, kind of we've had quite a low pressure year so far, but your final point there that the disease is expected to increase over coming weeks. Do you think growers can be too complacent at this point? What kind of top tips would you give to them?
Yeah, it's a difficult season really. I think the conditions in April have sort of halted septoria disease progress. Obviously important to watch out for yellow rust. In terms of septoria, I think everything this season has been quite late, so we're expecting septoria to increase, but potentially later in the season than we'd normally expect. So I guess, yeah, looking at your crops now, it is possible that we're seeing less disease and that's actually in the crops. But that said, if septoria is going to progress later than usual, by the time we start seeing severe symptoms, it should be quite late in the season. So in theory, the impacts on yield should be relatively small. Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Chloe. I'll segue straight into Sarah Cook. Sarah's joined us to talk about the Rob's overarching theme for one of his trials was managing weeds without herbicides, and Sarah managed the trial that kind of went on there at the site. So Sarah, thank you very much. I'll hand over to you. I think you're going to run us through the details of the trial and then what take homes we've got from it. Thank you.
Okay, so this is a trial set up basically to look at avoiding use of glyphosate. So we've got 3 treatments here in strips across the field, replicated, a power harrow and glyphosate, which is the farm standard, an alternative, the duckfoot springtime with no glyphosate, and a Vaderstad Culti Quattro with no glyphosate. So I'll show you in the next slide, I'll show you the soil types. So the soil types do vary across the field. We've got medium loams through to shallow soils over sandstone with a patch of heavy clay. And when we look at the head results, we'll be able to see if there's any difference between these soil types. And we have looked at soil structure as well, but I'm not going to present those results today. So on the next slide, you can see where the treatments coincide with the soil types, and we've put them diagonally across the field on the sort of longest axis to go with the tram lines. So next slide, please. So what were the weed levels like pre-treatment? So on the 18th of September, we really only found blackgrass on the headlands of the tram lines nearest the road. At 41 plants, which is a high level. We're looking for a lot less than that, but we didn't find any in the treatment tram lines. So overall, the field's got to quite a low level of blackgrass. Mainly spring barley volunteers from the previous crop, but with cleavers, charlock and groundsel. So the cultivation treatments were done on the 18th of September, and the spring tine and Vaderstad treatments which didn't receive any glyphosate, were repeated on the 30th of September, and the whole field was drilled on the single date of the 1st of October. So on the next slide, we'll look at the treatments. So this power harrow and glyphosate is the farm standard, done on the 18th September. The depth of cultivation range between 3 and 8 centimetres, and a good tilth, as you can see there, was achieved in the treatment. And the barley volunteers were completely uprooted and destroyed, so leaving quite a low and no weeds still going when it was drilled. So next slide, please. This is the springtime with no glyphosate, done first of all on the 18th September and repeated again on the 30th. Cultivation depth is shallow, between 4 and 7 centimetres, and this tended to leave the soil with mini ridges with large clumps in the strips, particularly on the heavy soil, so different effects on the different soil types. And there were quite a few spring volunteers that were still growing after the cultivation treatments. So on to the final treatment, next slide. This is the Vaderstad Culti Quattro, a more intensive cultivation, done as before as the other treatment on the 18th and 30th of September. It mostly 4 to 8 centimetres deep, but on the lighter soils you're getting a deeper cultivation down to 10 centimetres, and in the heavier soil 2 centimetres. So a big variation in cultivation depth on the different soil types, and it also struggled to penetrate the soil on the heavy soil treatment. It gave us a better tilth than treatment 2, which was the duckfoot cultivator, but still leaving medium to large clumps up to 15 to 25 centimetres in size on the heavier soils. It gave us a lot better spring barley removal than treatment 2, but still left spring barley growing in the soil at the time of drilling. So blackgrass numbers on the 26th of October. You can see here there's not a lot of blackgrass in the field, so some strips had high numbers and some strips had low numbers, and there were plenty of strips without any blackgrass at all, so not a field of concern. Next slide, please. So this year's count, so the spring count of blackgrass on the 4th of April, and you can see that there's quite low levels of blackgrass spread out through the trial. No variation between the treatments, and not really any differences between the different soil types. So still looking at low levels of blackgrass. And so we haven't done that yet. And so the next slide will show you is just a photograph taken the other day of the Vaderstad Culti Quattro, which received no glyphosate. You can see some blackgrass in there, but some of these lighter patches on the photographs are, well, I think they're BYDV, and you can see those on the photos, but a smattering of blackgrass throughout the trial. Next slide, please. So this is the duckfoot springtime. You see this is the strip up by the road on the shallow soil. You can see lighter patches, and I think this is BYDV rather than blackgrass. So little bits of blackgrass throughout this treatment as well. Next slide, please. And this is the farm standard, more BYDV here, but no real differences between these treatments, and just indicating and showing you that you can get away without using any glyphosate if you're doing cultivations and you've got the right weather conditions to kill the weeds after cultivations. So next slide, please. So how do we create a stale seed bed? starting in the right place, and it's always important with blackgrass to start in the right place with a low population and seed bank of blackgrass. So it's no use starting with high populations and expecting these cultivations to get rid of them. That's when you really do need a chemical, and you need some concentrated effort to get rid of blackgrass throughout the rotation. You've got to provide yourselves with an adequate window of opportunity between harvest and drilling. So that's why later drilling becomes important. So you've got that window in which you can do these cultivations. Then timing that cultivation, waiting until the soil is in a good condition and it's drying. So you really need a drying day to do these cultivations so that any weeds pulled up will die quite quickly on the surface, rather than, and weeds are very good, much better than crops where you pull them up and they're sitting in a clump of soil. They can reroot quite easily, and it doesn't deter them from growing on to produce seed. So having lots of machinery choices as well, lots of alternatives, a depth of working. So one piece of cultivation equipment doesn't suit the field on that day, taking a few items out there and having a go with it to see which is giving you the best kind of working depth and kill of weeds. Soil type, again, as we can see that we've had variations in cultivation depth and success throughout the range of soil types. And then things we can manage, more staff, because when you're relying a lot more on cultivations and moving away from herbicide, you do need greater opportunities in which to work the field on the right day with the right piece of equipment. So a high level of staff is quite useful. Then variety. What's your latest sowing date, early maturity, things to consider. We're wanting to drill these later to give us that bigger window, and early maturing varieties so that we can get them off early prior to harvest to increase the size of the window. Things we can't manage, weather conditions, always the case in the UK, always tempting to drill early because we know sometimes when the rain comes, the rain starts and that's it, we can't work it again. And drying days, good drying days with either sunshine or wind to get good weed depth. And temperature, we need an autumn where we've got good growing weather so that weeds are germinating, so that we can get them to germinate in that top layer and then use cultivation to get rid of them. So basically, it's basically working to keep ahead of the weeds, understanding their biology when they germinate and using all this to culturally control them. So our next steps on the next slide. So we've got a field, we've got a smattering of blackgrass here, so we have to decide whether we're going to take any action over this blackgrass. You know, are the populations low enough so that we can do some roguing? You have to remember that one plant has 10 heads. Each of these heads can contain about 100 seeds, so that's 1,000 seeds per plant. So it may look like a small problem this year, you leave it, and the next time it's 100 times worse, and that's when we get into problems. So it's considering that low populations are probably more important to control than really high populations at this time of year, and we wanted to stop these seeds from returning to the soil. So if we decided to spray out patches, so discrete patches with high populations, this would be done as soon as possible before the seed becomes fertile and starts to fall to the floor. We expect shedding to occur in early July, but the seeds are becoming fertile now. So we're always saying the last sort of week, the first sort of week in June is the latest time you can successfully get rid of blackgrass without it returning any fertile seeds. So do you know what the resistance status of the blackgrass is? You know, have you had it tested? Do you know what herbicides are more likely to work within rotations? We can use different crops within the rotation to control blackgrass, and we can use different herbicides. But we have to really know whether these herbicides are going to kill the blackgrass by knowing its resistance status. So the opportunity now is to collect seed and send it off for testing. And we're looking to collect seed as it sheds in early July. So also planning cropping for the next season. Should this go into a spring crop because we think populations are getting too high and we have to bring them back down again? Should we put it into a winter crop? Should we be drilling a late drilled winter wheat? Or should we be growing barley or a competitive crop like barley or a high seed rate? So lots of decisions to be made just looking at a field now before we go on for the next crop, considering how we're going to control that blackgrass within rotation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I've got one question that's come in here. It's almost aside to the strategic farm. It's kind of drawing on your other experiences, and the question is is there evidence to demonstrate that cover crops can have an impact on the autumn weed pressure? Is it what can cover crops do to be competitive with the weeds?
You're putting cover crops in at a time when the blackgrass is germinating. So cover crops themselves don't reduce the blackgrass, they don't kill the seed and they don't reduce the population. So putting a cover crop in where a thick cover crop can tend to prevent blackgrass seed from germinating, and it'll just wait till either the next year or later to germinate. So a more open cover crop will allow the blackgrass to germinate within it, and then you can kill the blackgrass off with the cover crop. We haven't seen any effects of cover crops actually killing seed. They tend to delay it, or where they're open, the blackgrass will germinate within them. But the act of cultivation and drilling will encourage the blackgrass to germinate. So cover crops will encourage blackgrass to germinate within them.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sarah. Really appreciate that. And then we'll move on to Sasha. Finally, we're going to go to Sasha, who's been Sasha coordinates a set of trials, and one of those is at the Strategic Farm West, and that's looking at cabbage stem flea beetle in oilseed rape, and looking at the impact of companion crops, organic amendments, and straw management. And that's what they did at the Strategic Farm West here. So yeah, Sasha, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Richard. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking through 3 trials that we carried out at Strategic Farm West this year. Just say all of these trials are part of a wider AHDB and industry-funded project, which is in its first year really, and it's going to be going on for another 2 years. So the first trial I wanted to cover was a trial looking at organic amendments. The idea behind using organic amendments for flea beetle control is that applying something like a slurry or a chicken muck to an establishing crop might either mask the smell of the crop from the flea beetles or actively deter them from entering the crop. So the treatments we looked at this year, we had an untreated control, and we also had a chicken muck treatment, and then we had an artificial end treatment where the nitrogen was applied to balance out the amount of nitrogen that was present in the chicken muck. All of these were applied along a single wide strips, and then we monitored flea beetle activity. So what did we find? Rich, if you can move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of plant establishment, that top graph there shows the plants per metre squared in each of the treatments, and at 2 growth stages. What we can see is at growth stage 11, there was really very little difference between the control and the chicken muck treatment. There were significantly fewer plants though in the artificial end treatment. And then by the second assessment, growth stage 14, we were seeing also significant reductions in plants in the chicken muck treatment compared to the control treatment. And this could be due to the fact that the chicken muck might be reducing the crop establishment, the ability of the plants to grow through the chicken muck. And in terms of the artificial end, it could be that these plants are just slightly more attractive because of their nitrogen content compared to the control treatments. When we look to the feeding damage, so the adult feeding damage, that's the percent leaf area lost, and that's the graph at the bottom. Again, we can see the 3 different treatments at 2 growth stages, And what we can see really is very little difference between the chicken muck and control treatments, slightly more and significantly more damage in the artificial end treatment of the first assessment, but by the second assessment, really there were very few differences between any of the treatments. Next slide, please. But I don't think that really tells the whole story, and here are some images of those treatments in October. We've got the control treatment on the left, the chicken muck treatment in the middle, and the artificial end on the right, and you can really see that by anyone's standard, the chicken muck treatment, the plants in that area of the field really are doing much better, certainly than the control treatment. And we then went on to measure the crop heights in December, and indeed, the chicken muck plants were significantly higher than the plants in the other two treatments. Next animation, please, Richard. And it's also worth saying that last year the Oilseed Rape Yield Enhancement Network ran an additional contest. They called it the Oilseed Rape Beauty Contest, where they compared oilseed rape crops from around the country in terms of how well they had established. And actually, this chicken muck treatment won the prize. And I think it really does sort of demonstrate how well those plants were establishing in that treatment. Next slide, please. We then went on to assess the larvae per plant in December in each of the treatments, and you can see that in the top graph there. I mean, you can see there were significantly higher numbers of larvae in the chicken muck and artificial end treatments compared to the control. This could have been due to the fact that flea beetle were choosing to lay their eggs in areas of the field which had the best looking plants. But when we take into account the size of the plants and therefore calculate the mean number of larvae per centimetre of plant height, and that's demonstrated in that graph at the bottom there, you can see that actually the differences between the control and chicken muck treatment really aren't there. They're no longer significant, although the artificial end treatment is still having significantly numbers of larvae per unit centimetre of plant height. Next slide, please. Then moving on to the second trial. This trial was looking at companion crops for managing flea beetle, and the theory here is that where you've got companion crops growing with the crop, then those companion crops may be making it more difficult for the flea beetle to find the crop, but also they may be doing things like providing shelter for natural enemies. So in this trial, we had 3 treatments. We had a control, so oilseed rape drilled on its own. Then we had a mix provided by Frontier, which contained fenugreek, bursting clover, and buckwheat. And then the third treatment was a mix provided by Lima grain, which contained fenugreek and bursting clover. So these companion crop mixes were drilled about a week before the oilseed rape, which was drilled on the 27th of August. And the idea behind that is that drilling the companion crop early gives those plants a chance to establish, and so they are providing that benefit whilst the oilseed rape is establishing. Next slide, please. So firstly, here's some data on the number of adult flea beetles we were finding in each of those treatments. So this is adults being caught in water traps, and we assessed this at 2 occasions, in the middle of September and then a week later on the 21st of September. And there were some slight trends here. So we were seeing fewer adults where we had a companion crop, where we had companion crops compared to the untreated, although those differences weren't significant. We then also looked at the amount of feeding damage in each area of the crop, and that's just shown with the percent leaf area lost on that graph on the bottom there. And you can see that damage in each of the treatments on the 2 assessment occasions. What you can see is that on both assessment occasions, the amount of feeding damage was lower where there was a companion crop mix. Those differences weren't significant on the first occasion, but by growth stage 14, those differences were significant. Although it's worth really emphasising here that the overall level of damage was very low. I mean, we were seeing maximums around 2% leaf area loss. So the question would be, would we see that same level of reduction where the pressure was higher? Next slide, please. And then here's just a couple of photos to demonstrate what those crops look like. So you can see on the left, we've got the oilseed rape on its own. It's just clearly oilseed rape drilled down the field. There's nothing else going on in that area of the field. In the middle, we've got the frontier mix, and you can see the bursting clover growing through there and above the plants. And on the right, you've got the lima grain mix, and you can see some of the fenugreek and buckwheat in there. And really, you know, that really just kind of illustrates the point. There's much more going on in a field where there is a companion crop mix. And so it's easy to see how it might be more, it's providing those benefits in terms of flea beetle control and providing cover for natural enemies. Next slide, please. We then went and assessed larval pressure in December, and here you can see the larvae per plant in each of the treatments. We were getting around 3 to 4 larvae per plant in December, which is a moderate level of pressure, but really there were very few differences between any of the treatments. Next slide, please. So just to go on to our final trial, we only had a very small field to work with here, so we could only look at really a look-see here. And here we were looking at straw management. So what are the benefits of leaving chopped straw? So we had 2 treatments. So one treatment along one tram line, the straw was baled and removed, and then on the other tram line, the straw was chopped and left. And the idea being here, again, where you're leaving straw, that might be making it more difficult for the flea beetle to find the oilseed rape. Next slide, please. So firstly, we looked at soil moisture, and we did find a slight increase in soil moisture where there was chopped straw, which kind of is as expected. The difference wasn't significant, but soil moisture is important because it really helps the crop grow away quickly where there's flea beetle pressure. Next slide, please. And then when we looked at the adult feeding damage in this trial, here we've got the percent leaf area lost under both treatments at the 2 assessment dates. What we can see really is that there were very few differences between the 2 treatments, although again there was very low flea beetle pressure in general in this trial. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, for chicken muck, there didn't really appear to be any great benefit in terms of flea beetle management, in terms of reducing the amount of damage seen. But we were seeing improved levels of establishment where the chicken muck was applied. For the companion crops, we were seeing lower levels of flea beetle feeding damage. For the chopped straw, there was no real impact on the levels of damage for the flea beetle, but we did see slightly improved soil moisture. I think, you know, what really is worth emphasising is as Rob mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, flea beetle pressure was pretty low this year. The crops established very nicely, and a really big part of that was the weather conditions were pretty kind last August, and really conducive to a crop establishing quickly, because the crop likes rain, the flea beetle essentially doesn't. Its activity will reduce where there's rain. Now we've got 2 more years of this trial, of this project to do, and we're going to be looking at further tramline trials throughout, and we're certainly planning to look at companion crops and organic amendments this year. And you know, we will be sort of putting out requests for growers who'd be willing to help us with this in the next couple of weeks. So do look out for that, or feel free to get in touch with Richard or me directly if you are interested. And final slide, please, Richard. So yeah, just to say, you know, thank you for listening, and also to acknowledge all of the organisations and companies that are part of this project, because it's a real industry-wide effort.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Sasha. I'm going to come straight to you while we've got you live for a question. This one's coming in. Is there anything to suggest that you'd see less flea beetle in direct drilled crops?
Yeah, there is some anecdotal evidence for that. I know someone who did a basis project looking at that, and they did see less flea beetle pressure where they had direct drilled compared to more intensive cultivations in neighbouring tramlines. So yes, there is some evidence for it, and the reason behind it might simply be because it's helping the crop establish much more quickly. It's retaining that soil moisture, but it could also be that there's a possibility that flea beetle are attracted a bit more to that to soil that's been moved. And it's something that we're going to be looking at in replicated trials, planning to do 2 trials on that actually this year as part of the project.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sasha. Kate, if it's all right, I'm going to come over to you. I've got a couple of questions for you that come in. We've done 3 years of the cultivation trial at Strategic Farm West. This person's asking if you're trialing and cultivation and establishment techniques at home, how long would you typically take before applying the results of a trial to a wider to the rest of your farm?
Yeah, hi. I guess the thing is maybe just to monitor how things are improving. So quick tests to do would be the FAIRS and the earthworm assessments. We found, really depends on how the weather conditions are from one year to the next. So, for example, on this trial last year, with in 2019 and 2020, when we couldn't get the oilseed rape to establish, it was a really difficult year to assess the benefits of direct drill. So it really just does vary really from year to year. So just bear that in mind. And yeah, if you can, carry out a VAIRS, carry out an earthworm assessments just to see how things are improving and track it over time. So
perfect. Thank you, Kate. I've got one more quick question to you before your dog goes completely crazy with you. It's fine, don't worry. Companion crops. Does fenugreek and clover have to be sprayed off before Christmas to reduce it out competing the oilseed rape? Would curb or astrocurb take them out?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that one.
We can follow that. I've got the details, so we can follow it up.
I think so, yeah.
Melissa will send you an educated response afterwards to that one. Right, I'm very conscious of time, and there's a Scottish webinar starting now as well with the same thing up there, so I'll push this on there. Any further information about anything you've heard today, then there's various ways of getting at it. The best way is Strategic Farm West website. You can either go to the AHDB website or type it directly into Google, and it will take you there. It gives you a summary of all the trials diaries, all the assessment results, everything to do with Strategic Farm. So I'd implore you all to look at that. Aside to that, with everything coming up and relevant at the moment, the Harvest Toolkit is really kind of what will be useful for everybody right now. It brings together all our resources into one place for all the harvest tools that you could use. So please do use that. We've also got the recommended list, which is honestly one of our kind of key areas for growers and agronomists, and the business impact calculator. With everything going on in the farming environment at the moment, it's a crucial tool for you to use. We've got other events for Strategic Farm Summer. This day is the first one of a few Fridays going through the month. We've got the Scotland webinar, which will be starting now, and then the Strategic Farm South launch meeting, which is at 12 noon, and that's down David Miller down in Hampshire. And then we've got a series of how-to workshops, a bit more interactive and a bit less kind of webinar, a bit more kind of discussion and interactive for the coming Fridays of the month. The first one's on the 11th of June, the plant health analysis. And then on the 18th of June, you've got in-field flowering strips. And then on Friday, the 25th of June, you've got the good, the bad, and the ugly, identifying your marginal land. And all of those have a foundation and an advanced level. So depending on what angle you're coming at, they cater for all needs. Have a look on the website as well. We've got the Arable Connections events. They'll be looking at. There's going to be some online, and we've also got events in Sarton Union and Hereford and various other things, looking at the AHDB variety trials and any other demonstrations and trials that might be going on. The Hereford one is later in June, on 22nd of June. So I had to plug the one in the West region, obviously. But have a look on the AHDB events website. You find them all of there. Also, the Monitor Farm meetings are all now, restrictions are allowing the Monitor Farm meetings are picking up, and there's more of those going on. So please do look into that. So yeah, just a reminder, thank you very much to all of our speakers today. Sorry it's been a bit of a kind of a push through, but you've all done fantastic things, keeping to time, being succinct and to the point, and giving us some great take-home messages. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a good day. Cheers, bye-bye.